Hi, today we're going to talk about the brain. This is brain number 2, the second section in our brain series. So let's start talking about the cerebellum. So if we look down here in orange is the cerebellum. It's also called the little brain. So in order to get your bearings about what we're looking at when we're studying the brain, we'll always know that the cerebellum is located posteriorly. So then we know this is the posterior side of the brain and this is the anterior region of the brain. So the primary functions of the cerebellum include adjusting our postural muscles. So it's making adjustments to our posture in order to maintain balance and equilibrium. It also is the fine tuning of our voluntary movements. It's coordinating our muscle groups to produce a fluidity of movements. For example, a ballerina. If you imagine how a ballerina dances and maintains balance and equilibrium, as well as the fluidity of movements, is all controlled by our cerebellum. There's a role in the cerebellum in learning, for example, the fine tuning of our motor activities, such as learning to ride a bike, and it also participates a role in cognitive functions such as memory and learning. So if we look at the anatomical regions of the cerebellum, this little center region is called the vermis. There's an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe um, controlling subconscious aspects of skeletal muscle movements. This little region in here is called the flocconodular lobe, also responsible for equilibrium and balance. Going back to the last section that we studied, the dural folds, there's a tentorium cerebelli, and this is a thin layer of dura mater that separates the cerebellum from the cerebrum. And there's also another durafold that separates the right and the left lobes of the cerebellum called the falx cerebelli. That's not listed here. Transverse fissures is a groove that separates the right and left halves of the brain, the cerebrum, plus the cerebellum. So if we look at a transverse image of the cerebellum, we could see these gray, like little folds of gray matter that increase the neural tissue of the cerebellum, and those are called folia. So the folia are the folds within the cerebellum, where in the cerebrum they're called gyri. The arbor vitae is the white matter, or this white area in between there, the white matter tracts that exist through this. There's cerebellar peduncles that carry a variety of information. There's an inferior one that carries information in from our balance or vestibular apparatus. There's a middle peduncle which carries voluntary movements and connects to the pons, and then a superior cerebellar peduncle which connects to the red nuclei and the midbrain. So I wouldn't worry about all these details as much as the general function of the cerebellum, which is coordinating skilled movements, regulating posture and balance subconsciously. So to understand the cerebellum in more detail, it's helpful to understand what would happen if there was a dysfunction of the cerebellum. So a dysfunction of the cerebellum is similar that what you would experience if you were very intoxicated or due to a stroke or any kind of trauma. It would cause ataxia. What ataxia is an inability, for example, to walk straight. So it's a disturbance of our muscular system. So in severe ataxia, an individual, just like somebody who's really intoxicated, cannot stand, cannot sit or walk without help. Somebody who's very intoxicated can slur their speech. So all these coordinated movements are effective. and then these movements are not smooth and coordinated anymore. So let's go to the next region, and that's called the diencephalon. So the diencephalon in 3 regions. This is thalamus. Underneath it is the hypothalamus, and posterior to it is a region called the epithalamus. So again, looking at this image, we know this is posterior because we could see the cerebellum, and this is anterior. So let's start with the thalamus, which is the little blue circle here. Makes up of 80% of our diencephalon, and we consider the thalamus as a major relay station. We'll discuss this in more detail. So let's talk about some anatomical features. See this little circle here? That's called the intermediate mass, which joins the right and left halves of the thalamus. The thalamus itself also forms the wall of the third ventricle. Remember, the third ventricles were where those hollow spaces within the brain that produce cerebrospinal fluid. Within the thalamus, there's an internal capsule, which is a region of white matter tracts that are considered as the major relay station of sensory information that's coming in from the spinal cord and the brain stem. And at this region, it's going to send the information to the cerebral cortex for processing. Some of the general actions of the thalamus is allowing for crude sensory awareness, sensation of pain, temperature, pressure. So it helps reinforce voluntary motor activity and regulates some of our autonomic activity. So the thalamus is made up of 7 nuclei. So I wouldn't get into all these details, but generally know that the thalamus has each specific nuclei specifically controlling different parts of our system. Below it is the hypothalamus, so it's located inferior to the thalamus. And the hypothalamus is a major regulator of our homeostatic functions. It controls and integrates activities of the autonomic nervous system and also the pituitary end. So within the hypothalamus, we also have different regions. You can see here the mammillary region, the tuberal region, supraoptic and preoptic, controlling different regions of our systems. If you see here, this little stalk here is called the infundibulum, which connects to the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is an important gland which controls the hormones for both and also male and female sexual characteristics. So some general functions of the hypothalamus is controlling the subconscious control of skeletal muscle contractions, which includes our expression of emotions such as pain, pleasure, or rage. It also controls our autonomic functions. For example, our controlling centers that control heart and respiratory rate and visceral activities. It controls the nervous and endocrine system, so it regulates our hormones, such as through the pituitary gland. 2 hormones that are controlled by the hypothalamus are the antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. The antidiuretic hormone is important in the kidneys, in the nephrons, to prevent excessive water loss from the kidneys. And oxytocin is important, particularly in a pregnant woman, which will allow her to relax the ligaments around her uterus in order for childbirth to occur. It's also important for emotional and behavioral drives, such as the feelings of hunger and thirst. It coordinates our voluntary and autonomic functions, regulation of body temperature, and controls our circadian rhythms, which is our regulation of the sleep-wake cycle. So posteriorly, we have the epithalamus. So the epithalamus consists of a pineal gland, and the importance of this pineal gland is that it secretes melatonin. Melatonin is a hormone that promotes sleepiness. Currently, you could buy melatonin over the counter in order to promote sleep if needed. Uh, in the epithalamus, there's a habenular nuclei, which is responsible for olfaction and memory. The basal nuclei, you can see located right here, consists of 3 nuclei deep in the white matter around the thalamus, cerebrum, and midbrain. It coordinates our gross autonomic muscle movements and regulates muscle tone. And you can see these nuclei right here, the caudate, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. It also inhibits unwanted activity and unwanted muscle contractions. So again, what would happen if the basal nuclei was not functioning correctly or degenerative? Because it affects our body movements, our cognition, and behavior. So certain diseases associated with that, one is Parkinson's disease. So somebody with Parkinson's disease, it's a degenerative process from an inability to have enough dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter released from the neurons of the substantia nigra in the midbrain, and also affects the basal nuclei, the putamen and the caudate nucleus. And this condition will produce uncontrollable shaking and rigidity. Other conditions associated with issues with the basal nuclei are Huntington's disease, which is also a degenerative process that will have rapid jerking movements and involuntary without purpose. Tourette syndrome is an involuntary movement or tics, and sometimes vocal tics, where you're just like saying things that are inappropriate. Schizophrenia is a dysfunctional behavioral problem where often you can have hallucinations, paranoia, delusions, and obsessive compulsive, where you have continuous repetitive thoughts and repetitive activities, all associated with the basal nuclei. The limbic system is the emotional aspect of behavior related to control, the emotional aspects of behavior related to survival. So know for your exam, the limbic system is generally our emotional brain. It's responsible for emotions such as pain, pleasure, affection, anger, assists with motivation, emotion, learning, and memory. You could see it throughout here, the limbic system. So let's move on to the top here, which is called the cerebrum. So when we think of the cerebrum, it's called the seat of intelligence. So this is associated with our ability to read, write, compose music, do math calculations, personality, remembers the past, and plans for the future. So if we're looking at the cerebrum, let's go over some of the anatomical regions that we have to know here. So first of all, you can see here this outer dark yellow region is called the cerebral cortex. So the cerebral cortex in the brain is the outer rim of gray matter, where the inside is the white matter. Remember, it was the opposite in the spinal cord. The cerebral cortex also has 2 hemispheres, a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere, and it's separated by a division or an actual separation called the longitudinal fissure. You could see these folds. So these folds are called gyri. So it's important to know that these folds are called gyri, where they're like folds or fissures or deep grooves. And then the little shell, the fissure, the longitudinal fissure is a deep separation or deep groove. And the sulci are these little small grooves that exist here. So on this image, this is called the gyri, And then the little fold in here is called a sulci, where the deeper groove is the longitudinal fissure. So here you can see the longitudinal fissure separating the right and the left lobes. So if we could take a mid-sagittal section of the brain, separating it into, what would we see? So first of all, the longitudinal fissure separates the right hemisphere from the left hemisphere of the cerebrum. There's also, if we open that up, we would see the cerebral cortex, or this outer layer of gray matter. As we get down here, there's the corpus callosum, which is a white matter that connects the right and the left hemispheres. So it's the way the right and left hemisphere connect, and that's called the corpus callosum. If we also separated this region, we would see this region of dura matter called the falx cerebri. Remember, this also separates the right and the left hemisphere, one from each other. So this is the corpus callosum. It's the white matter connecting the two. The longitudinal fissure separates the cerebrum and the cerebellum between right and left side. And then in between here is also the falx cerebri, which is a layer of dura matter. So when we're looking at this region, these little mounds are called gyri, and the little grooves are called sulci. So we have some three principal sulci that we want to pay attention to. So first of all, going back, remember when we studied the skull and we learned the different regions of the skull, and how I mentioned that the regions of the cerebrum are similar. So seeing this brain, we know this is posterior because we could see the cerebellum, and this is anterior. So going over the lobes, this is called the frontal lobe, which is a unpaired lobe. There's only one. Here is the parietal lobe, and there's two of these, a right and a left. This is the temporal lobe. There's also a paired, a right and left. And the back is the occipital lobe, which is not paired. There's only one. So let's talk about these little sulci, which separate these lobes. So this one here is called the central sulcus, which separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. Back here, it's called the parietal occipital sulcus, separating the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. And laterally is called the lateral sulcus, which separates the temporal lobe from the parietal and the frontal lobe. So let's go over the lobes of the cerebrum. And again, now we know this is anterior and this is posterior. Here's the cerebellum. So this is called the frontal lobe. Okay, and remember, this would be the central sulcus, right? This is the parietal lobe, which is a paired lobe. Make sure you know these differences for your exams. Here is the parietal occipital sulcus, separating the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. Here is the temporal lobe and the lateral sulcus, separating the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe from the temporal lobe. And this is not paired. The temporal lobe is a paired lobe. The other lobe that exists is called the insula. This is deep inside, underneath the temporal lobe. So let's go over the functional organization of the cerebral cortex. So first, let's review. This is the central sulcus, right? And this is the frontal lobe, and this is the occipital lobe, and this would be the temporal lobe. So you see the sulcus, and remember we called the grooves sulcus and the little mounds gyri, okay? So the gyri on the red is called the precentral gyrus. So it's like in front of the central sulcus. And the mound on the blue is called the postcentral gyrus. behind the central sulcus, okay? So the thing we do have to know is that the precentral gyrus is called the primary motor area. And this is all part of the frontal lobe. And the postcentral gyrus is called the primary somatosensory area. So all of this in here is called the parietal lobe. So reviewing some of these other areas, in front of this prefrontal, the primary motor cortex or the precentral gyrus is the premotor area, which is part of the frontal lobe. And then here is the prefrontal cortex, and we'll discuss the functions of that. I'm just going over the anatomical regions here. So behind the central sulcus, we have the postcentral gyri, or the mound, and this is the primary somatosensory area. And then right behind that, which is part of the parietal lobe, is the somatosensory association area. So back in here, this is the occipital lobe, and it's the primary visual association area. And out here would be the temporal lobe, and this is the primary auditory area. Sorry, just trying to connect. Okay, sorry about that. My computer was going to die. So other areas we're going to talk about is the Broca's speech area. You can see here is located in the frontal lobe, and then the Wernicke's speech area is located in here, and it's located in between the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe. So again, this is a review of what we talked about. Here's the central sulcus. So the groove in front, the gyri in front of the central sulcus is called the precentral gyri, and it's considered a primary motor cortex. In front of it is the premotor cortex, and this is the frontal lobe, and also the Broca's speech area is located here. The gyri behind the central sulcus is called the postcentral gyri, or the primary somatosensory cortex, and this is the somatosensory association region. The importance of this is that, remember when we talked about the spine, sensory information was coming in posterior and motor information is going inferior, in front. So remember, you get pushed from behind and you go forward. So all of this is receiving sensory information. All of this is the reaction or the motor integration. So other regions we'll talk about is the visual cortex in the occipital lobe, the auditory cortex in the temporal lobe. There's a gustatory, which is tasting cortex, which is within the insula that we talked about a little while ago. So let's break down each of these lobes and discuss the important characteristics of each. So here's the central sulcus. Make sure you know that. This little gyri is the primary motor cortex. So the primary cortex is located in that precentral gyri, and it controls the conscious control of precise, skilled, and voluntary movements. The premotor cortex is important for integrating that information and controlling repetitive or pattern motor skills, and you can see this is located in front of that precentral gyrus. The one that's located in the frontal lobe is called the Broca's speech area. This is an area that directs the muscles of the tongue. So what happens if we damage Broca's area, you know what to say, and this condition is called non-fluent aphasia. You know what to say, but you cannot pronounce the words. So for example, if you want to say, I want to go home, it would just sound like versus words. The prefrontal cortex here is where we have our intellect, our cognition, personality, intellectual functioning, and predicting consequences are located in the prefrontal cortex. Often our laws understand that teenagers do not have a completely mature prefrontal cortex. It generally matures around our mid-20s, a little before then. So therefore, teenagers are not always good about predicting consequences. So here's our set. This is the parietal lobe right here in blue. So the parietal lobe is located everywhere behind the central sulcus. The first gyri is called the primary somatosensory cortex. It's located in that post-central gyrus, meaning behind the central sulcus. And this is receiving information from the skin and skeletal muscles associated with touch, proprioception, temperature, and pain. This lighter blue region is called the somatosensory association cortex, where it's integrating all that information coming in order to process it quickly. So here's the primary somatosensory cortex, and this is the somatosensory association area behind that. In the posterior region is the occipital lobe. So the occipital lobe has an important cortex called the primary visual cortex. This receives the visual information from the retinas to the optic lobe, and it has the visual association area, which is stimulating that visual input for a reaction. It sees the color, form, and movements of what we're seeing. The temporal lobe is here in green. It's one of the paired lobes. So the temporal area is primarily the auditory cortex. So it's receiving information related to pitch, rhythm, and loudness. It also has the auditory association area where it stores memories of sounds, permits perception of sounds. Within the temporal lobe and partially into the parietal lobe is another speech area called Wernicke's area. So Wernicke's area, you can comprehend written and spoken words, but you can speak the words, but you don't put the words in a way that's understandable. So we call that fluent aphasia or a word salad. So for example, if you wanted to say, I want to go home, you may say, home, want, climb, tree, versus I want to go home. Within this region too, we have the olfactory tracts that terminate within the temporal lobe in the inferior region of the lateral sulcus. So make sure you know the difference between Broca's speech area and Wernicke's. So the way I memorize Broca's is in the front, because B comes before W in the alphabet. And Broca's speech area is in the frontal lobe and causes the non-fluent aphasia. So because it's a motor affect to our tongues, you cannot speak the words. It would just sound like if you want to say, I want to go home. Wernicke's area is located partially in the temporal lobe and a little bit in the parietal lobe. This person can speak the words, but it comes out like a word salad. So for example, if you want to say, I want to go home, you could possibly say rain car, porch, dinner, pen, versus what you really want to say. So know the difference of Broca's, located in the frontal lobe, Wernicke's is posterior, located near the temporal and the parietal lobe. So when we're talking about the organization of fibers from the tracts that connect our hemispheres and within the hemisphere itself, we're going to talk about 3 different tracts. So the association tracts are axons that connect impulses between the gyri, or these little mounds on the same side of the hemisphere. So it's controlling and connecting the information between each gyri on the same side of, like, for example, the right or the left hemisphere. The commissural tracts is the one you should know. The commissural tracts are white matter that connect the right and the left hemispheres together. And the important one that we will study is called the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum is a commissural tract connecting the right and the left hemisphere. Projection tracts are tracts or white matter that can connect the cerebrum to lower parts of the central nervous system. So we are done with this section. Have a good day.